Picture this. You crouch behind a cold marble pillar deep inside the Vatican's most sacred halls. The year is 1501 AD. Incense curls through the air, but mingled with it is something far more intoxicating. The flicker of candelabras paints moving shadows across frescoed ceilings, and from somewhere beyond the columns comes a rustle of silk and the sound of laughter that does not belong in holy chambers. Your pulse hammers in your chest as you realize you are about to witness what no mortal should ever behold. An orgy so shocking, so debased, that even the pagans of Rome's past might turn away in shame. The October wind drifting through Vatican windows carries the scent of roasted chestnuts. Harmless, ordinary chestnuts. But tonight, these humble fruits will become scandalous instruments in a performance that will forever stain the papacy's reputation. In the private rooms of Cesare Borgia, son of Pope Alexander VI, 50 courtesans prepare for an evening of sin that will be whispered in hushed tones for centuries. Preserved in hidden diaries locked away in the Vatican archives, this scandal became a forbidden confession that the Church tried desperately to bury beneath layers of prayer and ritual. Before we descend into this world of indulgence and corruption, let me ask, if you enjoy uncovering the darkest corners of history, where truth is stranger than myth, hit that like button and subscribe for more forbidden tales. And comment below, where in the world are you listening from? It amazes me that across oceans and centuries, we share the same curiosity for the hidden truths of the past. But to understand how this night of shame came to be, we must return to the beginning, to the life of the man who would become remembered as the most immoral pope in history, Rodrigo Borgia. He was born Rodrigo de Borja on January 1st, 1431, in the small Spanish town of Zataiva, near Valencia. His youth was filled not with divine visions, but with the dust of Spanish roads and the ambition of a family already climbing the ladder of ecclesiastical power. His uncle Alfonso de Borja would ascend to the papacy as Pope Calixtus III in 1455, and from that moment Rodrigo's fate was sealed like wax on a papal bull. At just 25, Rodrigo became cardinal deacon, not through holiness or spiritual devotion, but through the old art of nepotism that ran to the church like poison in a dying man's veins. Arriving in Rome, the young Spaniard carried hunger in his eyes and fire in his heart. Rome in the late 15th century was a place of extremes, a city where saints were worshipped by day and sin sold by night. Pilgrims prayed at glittering altars, while only streets away, flesh was bought and sold openly. The papal court itself had become a marketplace, where even forgiveness had a price. And Rodrigo understood this better than anyone. He began weaving his web like a spider, gathering wealth and favors, hoarding benefices across Europe. His life was not that of a humble servant of God, but of a Renaissance prince. Lavish banquets, palaces of marble, and mistresses who bore him children as reliably as autumn brought harvests. His most famous liaison was with Venazia Catenii, a Roman noblewoman whose cunning matched her beauty. Between 1474 and 1482, she bore him 4 children who would become central players in one of history's most scandalous dramas, Juan, Cesare, Lucrezia, and Jaffer. Each child was a pawn on Rodrigo's chessboard, moved and sacrificed in the ruthless game of power. Even before he wore the papal tiara, Rodrigo's life shocked Rome. So scandalous were his actions that Pope Pius II himself wrote him a furious letter in 1460, condemning his shameful behavior in Siena, a city left stunned by the young cardinal's excesses. But shame was not something Rodrigo Borgia could afford. His eyes were fixed on one goal, only the papacy. And when that time came, he would claim the throne of St. Peter not with prayers and humility, but with gold, deceit, and the blood of enemies. The conclave of August 1492 was no holy gathering of men seeking God's will. It was a marketplace of corruption, a theater of bargaining where the fate of Christendom was bought and sold beneath the frescoed ceilings of the Sistine Chapel. 23 cardinals gathered to choose the next vicar of Christ. Yet what unfolded was not divine inspiration, but simony, the buying and selling of sacred offices. Gold moved as easily as whispers. Promises slid across the chamber like smoke. Ecclesiastical benefices were traded like bread in the marketplace. And when the white smoke finally rose, it was Rodrigo Borgia who emerged triumphant, crowned as Pope Alexander VI. Everyone knew the truth. This was no victory of holiness, but of gold, yet the people of Rome celebrated with surprising joy. for they had grown used to the Spaniard, and expected his reign to bring magnificence. The city erupted with fire and light. Bonfires burned upon the 7 hills. Torches blazed through ancient streets. Triumphal arches rose like prayers made visible in wood and stone. On August 26, 1492, his coronation filled St. Peter's Basilica with ovations so thunderous that observers claimed no pope had ever received such applause. At first, Alexander VI seemed determined to live up to the grandeur of that moment. He restored order to Rome's lawless streets, where assassinations had become daily routine. He created districts, appointed magistrates, and even sat in judgment himself each Tuesday, hearing petitions with remarkable energy. For a brief moment, it seemed as if Providence had indeed chosen the right man. But power is a mirror. It reveals more than it creates. And in Alexander VI, the mirror showed not holiness, but obsession. The ruthless ambition elevated his family above all else. His eldest son, Juan, was made Duke of Gandia and wed into Spanish nobility. His second son, Cesare, though only 18, was granted the Archbishopric of Valencia and later a cardinal's hat. Offices he wore not as sacred callings, but as stepping stones to worldly glory. The Vatican apartments, once intended as places of prayer and governance, became instead a stage. Here, the sacred and profane danced together in a grotesque performance. Banquets lasted till dawn. Musicians, actors, and courtesans mingled with cardinals and ambassadors. And at the center of this theater moved Alexander's mistress, Julia Farnese, whose beauty earned her the name Julia la Bella. She wandered the papal halls as freely as any prince of the church, her very presence a reminder that vows of chastity had been cast aside like yesterday's cloak. But amid this carnival of splendor and lust stood a silent observer, a man whose quill would capture every scandal with unflinching detail. His name was Johann Burchard, the papal master of ceremonies. A man born in Alsace around 1450, trained in canon law, and elevated not for grandeur, but for precision. He was no poet, no dramatist. He wrote with the dry, meticulous eye of an accountant, and in that dryness lay his power. From 1483 onward, Burchard began keeping his Liber Notarum, a diary of papal life. He recorded everything, from the solemnity of coronations to the shocking excesses of Alexander's court. He was invisible, always present, always forgotten, yet always watching. Cardinals trusted him with their ceremonies, ambassadors overlooked him in their intrigues, and courtesans ignored him as though he were furniture. But his pen never forgot. His diary would one day become the single most damning record of Alexander's corruption, and soon it would preserve the details of a scandal so infamous that the Vatican would lock it away in its secret archives for centuries. The seeds of that scandal were already taking root. For in Alexander's family, ambition was a flame that consumed everything, and it was his son one who would soon ignite tragedy. By the late 1490s, the Borgia name had spread across Europe, not with admiration but with suspicion. Rome whispered their vices. Foreign courts sneered at their ambition. And the most troubling of all was Alexander's beloved son, Juan, Duke of Gandia. Handsome, favored, showered with titles, Juan should have been the jewel of the family. Instead, he was its greatest liability. Rumors swirled of his cruelty, his arrogance, his reckless indulgence. He was no warrior, though Alexander thrust him into military command. He was no statesman, though the Pope boasted of his noble blood. Even among Rome's decadent elite, Juan's behavior was excessive. He drank, he gambled, he preyed upon women. His arrogance earned him enemies in every corner of Eternal City. And then came the night of June 14th, 1497. Rome awoke to a rumor that spread like wildfire. The Duke of Gandia had vanished. For days, the city seethed with tension. Then, at last, his body was found, floating lifeless in the Tiber, throat cut, chest pierced by 9 stab wounds, weighted with stones to sink, yet still carried to the surface as if the river itself rejected him. The assassination shocked Rome, but within the Vatican it broke the heart of Alexander VI. Witnesses spoke of the Pope shutting himself away, refusing food, refusing sleep. For 3 days he wept, not as a prince of the church, but as a shattered father. The mighty Borgia patriarch, who had intimidated kings, now sobbed in grief so profound that courtiers whispered, "Perhaps at last God's justice has fallen upon him." The murder also ignited speculation. Who had killed Juan? Was it a rival noble family? Was it vengeance for his many sins? Or, more darkly still, was it his own brother Cesare, who despised Juan's favored position and hungered for a destiny beyond the church? History would never prove the culprit, but suspicion clung to Cesare's shadow like blood to a dagger. In the depths of despair, Alexander attempted what critics had long demanded: reform. From his grief, he declared new laws against simony, against clerical excess, against the concubinage that had plagued the papal court. He called for the chancery to be reorganized, and a commission of cardinals drafted ordinances that foreshadowed the Council of Trent nearly half a century later. For a brief moment, it seemed tragedy had awakened the Pope's conscience. Perhaps some dared to hope Juan's death would lead to a purified papacy. But Rodrigo Borgia was a man of appetites, not discipline, and grief, like all emotions in him, burned bright and then vanished like smoke. Within months, the reforms were forgotten, locked away in dusty chests like discarded love letters. His tears had dried. His heart turned again to the living. And now, all his ambition, his wealth, his schemes, his ruthless energy shifted onto a single son, Cesare Borgia. If Juan had been Alexander's heart, Cesare would become his sword, cold, sharp, and merciless. And in Cesare's rise, the Borgias would carve a path so bloody and brilliant that even Machiavelli himself would use his name as the model for prince. The death of Juan did not end the Borgias. It transformed them. Alexander VI, once a grieving father, turned his gaze toward the one son who remained his greatest weapon, Cesare Borgia. Until then, Cesare had lived the life of a prince of church. At barely 18, he had been made Archbishop of Valencia. At 20, a cardinal. But Cesare was no priest, no humble servant of Christ. He wore the scarlet robes like a mask, concealing a restless hunger for power. It was said his eyes burned not with faith, but with calculation. His hands, so skilled in ritual blessings, longed instead for the weight of a sword. And soon he would cast aside the church entirely. In 1498, after the French King Charles VIII died, the new monarch Louis XII sought to annul his marriage. Rome's approval was essential. Alexander seized the moment. In exchange for granting Louis his divorce, the Pope demanded rewards for Cesare. Thus, in a maneuver both scandalous and brilliant, Cesare shed his cardinal's hat, the first man in papal history to renounce the College of Cardinals voluntarily, and was created Duke of Valentinois, a title that would make Europe tremble. France welcomed him not as priest, but as nobleman. Louis XII gave him troops, gold, and even arranged his marriage to Charlotte d'Albret, sister of the King of Navarre. Through this union, Cesare entered the circle of royalty itself. No longer bound to the altar, he strode into the world of conquest. And Rome watched with a mixture of awe and dread. Cesare returned to Italy not with prayers, but with an army. His father blessed him not with scripture, but with banners of war. His mission: to carve out a dominion for the Borgia family, a state of their own in the turbulent lands of central Italy. The papal states had long been fractured, their towns ruled by petty lords, mercenary captains, and proud city-states that paid only lip service to Rome. Cesare's task was to break them, to bend them beneath Borgia power. And he did so with ruthless brilliance. One by one, cities fell. Imola, Forli, Pesaro, Rimini, each subdued not by negotiation, but by a mix of cunning and cruelty. Those who resisted were crushed. Those who submitted were rewarded, only to be discarded later, when no longer useful. Even those who despised him could not deny his genius. Ambassadors wrote of his cold discipline, his silence, his terrifying efficiency. Soldiers whispered that he feared no man, no dagger, no god. Among the many who observed him was a Florentine envoy named Niccolò Machiavelli. Sent by the Republic of Florence to negotiate with Cesare, Machiavelli studied him closely. He watched how Cesare rewarded loyalty with riches and betrayed traitors with sudden death, how he used mercy as a mask and terror as a weapon, how he struck swiftly before his enemies could unite. In Cesare Borgia, Machiavelli saw not a tyrant, but model a living lesson in the art of power. Years later, when he wrote The Prince, he would hold up Cesare as the ideal ruler. Feared, respected, relentless. And yet, Cesare was still young. His conquests were only beginning. Behind him stood the full weight of the papacy. His father, Alexander VI, an old man now, but still cunning, still eager to see the Borgia eagle soar above Italy. Together, father and son would attempt the unthinkable. Not only to dominate the papal states, but to create a dynasty that could rival kings. But in the shadows, plots already stirred. Italy was a land of daggers hidden in cloaks, of poison in jeweled cups. And for every city Cesare conquered, another enemy sharpened a blade. The Borgias had risen higher than any family before them, and soon they would discover how far there was to fall. By the dawn of the new century, Cesare Borgia had become the terror of Italy. His campaigns across the Romagna were swift, merciless, and calculated. City after city bent the knee, not out of love, but out of sheer fear. In Imola and Forli, he humbled the powerful Caterina Sforza, a countess as ruthless as any man, who had once defied armies from the walls of her fortress. But Cesare broke her defenses with French cannon, dragged her into captivity, and showed Italy that not even the proudest could resist him. The Borgias were no longer just a family of schemers in Rome. They were rulers, warlords, princes. And while Cesare conquered with steel, his father Alexander VI celebrated in the Vatican with feasts and pleasures that scandalized the world. The papal palace, once a seat of solemnity, became infamous as a theater of excess. Courtiers, mistresses, poets, soldiers, and foreign envoys gathered nightly in spectacles of food, music, and unrestrained desire. The most notorious of these was whispered about for centuries afterward, the Banquet of Chestnuts. Held in 1501 within the Apostolic Palace, it was no holy feast. Instead, it was a carnival of lust. Witnesses, among them the papal master of ceremonies Johann Burchard, recorded the details with a mixture of fascination and horror. By the glow of hundreds of candles, 50 courtesans were said to have danced unclothed before the Pope, Cesare, and Lucrezia. As music played, golden candlesticks lit the marble halls. Tables overflowed with delicacies and wine. Then, the courtesans were made to crawl across the floor, scrambling to pick up chestnuts scattered upon the ground, while the Borgias and their guests watched with laughter and wagers. What followed was even darker, games of indulgence, where prizes were awarded to those men who proved their virility the greatest, their sins the boldest. The Vatican, once sanctified by saints and martyrs, echoed instead with debauchery. And yet, the scandal was more than sin. It was power. For Alexander and Cesare, indulgence was another weapon, a display of dominance over both flesh and spirit. They defied the Church's own laws openly, daring anyone to challenge them. Still, whispers spread like plague. Priests muttered sermons against corruption. Ambassadors carried tales back to Europe's courts, where kings shook their heads in disgust. Even among Romans hardened to decadence, there was unease. But none dared confront the Borgias, not while Alexander ruled, and not while Cesare's armies marched. It was during this time that Lucrezia Borgia herself became more than a pawn. Married off again, this time to Alfonso d'Este Ferrara, she transformed from scandalous bride to shrewd duchess. Though Rome had once painted her as a temptress and poisoner, Ferrara would know her as a skilled ruler, patroness of the arts, and a woman who, unlike her father and brother, learned to survive by tempering ambition with grace. As the new century unfolded, Cesare's dominion stretched across central Italy. Town after town fell, their rulers captured or executed, their castles marked with the Borgia bull. But as his power grew, so did the circle of his enemies. The Orsini, the Colonna, the Sforza, the Republic of Venice, Florence, even the King of Naples, all feared what would happen if Cesare truly welded the papacy into a dynasty. And so daggers were sharpened in secret. Because Italy's history was never kind to those who reached too high. The Borgias had turned the Vatican into a palace of flesh, and the papal states into a battlefield of fire. But their glory stood on unstable ground. And soon, a twist of fate would begin their undoing. By 1502, Cesare Borgia stood at the height of his power. From the fortress of Urbino to the plains of the Romagna, he ruled not as a vassal, but as a prince in his own right. His banner, the red bull of the Borgias, fluttered over conquered citadels. His enemies lay crushed, his allies subdued. Even the great lords of Italy, who once mocked him as the Pope's bastard, now bent the knee or plotted in whispers. But Cesare's strength was not only in arms. He had perfected the art of manipulation when rivals gathered against him. The Orsini, the Baglioni, the Vitelli, and the De Verano, he lured them into a trap under the pretense of reconciliation. Cesare invited them to a council in Senigallia. They came cautiously, cloaked in suspicion. But Cesare embraced them warmly, promised friendship, even dined with them. Then, when the moment was right, he struck. The doors closed. His mercenaries surrounded the hall. One by one, his rivals were seized. Some were strangled that very night, others imprisoned before execution. It was ruthless. It was brilliant. It was pure Cesare. And Machiavelli, who witnessed it, declared the act of a true prince. Swift, decisive, unforgettable. With the treachery of Senigallia, Cesare proved there was no force in Italy that could oppose him. But fate is a silent enemy. In August of 1503, Rome sweltered in the heat of summer. The air grew heavy, the Tiber ran low, and with the stench came death. A plague spread through the city. And in the midst of this sickness, tragedy struck the Borgias. At a banquet in the vineyards of Cardinal Adriano Castellisi, both Pope Alexander VI and Cesare fell violently ill after drinking wine. Some whispered it was poison meant for others, accidentally consumed by the Pope himself. Others said it was simply plague. But the result was the same. The once mighty Alexander VI, the most cunning Pope Rome had ever seen, wasted away with fever. His swollen body turned dark, his breath shallow. On August 18th, 1503, he died. The Vatican was thrown into chaos. Cardinals fled the city, fearing disease. Servants plundered the papal apartments, looting gold and jewels before the corpse had even cooled. Cesare, too, lay sick, but he survived, barely, weak and fevered. He dragged himself through the halls of power, desperate to secure the papacy for a man who would protect the Borgia legacy. But here his fortune failed. The conclave of cardinals, shaken by the scandal of Alexander's reign, elected Pope Pius III, who died within weeks. Then came Julius II, the warrior pope, sworn enemy of the Borgias. In that moment, Cesare's world collapsed. His father gone, his enemies emboldened, his own health ruined, Cesare found himself surrounded. One by one, his allies abandoned him. French support faltered. Italian lords who once cowered now rose in rebellion. Cesare Borgia, who had nearly forged a kingdom, now fought not to rule, but to survive. Still, even in decline, he was dangerous. His enemies feared that, given time, he might rise again. And so they hunted him with the same ferocity he once unleashed on them. The bull of the Borgias was wounded, and soon it would be cornered. The death of Pope Alexander VI had torn the heart out of the Borgia dynasty. Without the Pope's hand to shield him, Cesare Borgia found himself a prince without a throne, a soldier without allies, and a commander whose fortune had run dry. His enemies struck quickly. Julius II, the new pope, hated the Borgias with a fury. He stripped Cesare of his titles, seized his lands, and declared his rule over the papal states finished. Cesare, once feared across Italy, now stood abandoned. His French allies turned cold, his mercenaries melted away, and the same lords who had once bowed before him now hunted him like prey. In 1504, betrayed by the French king he had trusted, Cesare was arrested and shipped across the mountains of Spain. There, he was cast into a prison in Castile, the bastard prince of the Vatican, now reduced to a captive in chains. But Cesare Borgia was not made to die behind stone walls. After years of confinement, he escaped, scaling the fortress walls in the dead of night, slipping through the shadows like a wolf returning to the wild. He fled to Navarre, the land of his wife, Charlotte d'Albret, hoping to rebuild his power. Yet destiny had no empire left to give him. In the spring of 1507, Cesare rode into battle once more, this time not as a lord of Rome, but as a captain serving his brother-in-law, the King of Navarre. He was only 31, still burning with ambition, still certain that his fortune would turn again. On the fields near Viana, he faced his final fight. Surrounded by enemy soldiers, Cesare fought with a ferocity that had once crushed Italian princes. But there were no armies at his back now, no papal power to shield him, no father to plot his salvation. He was struck down in the mud, pierced by pikes and swords. When the dawn came, his body was found naked and stripped, abandoned by his foes. The bull of the Borgias was dead. Cesare's enemies rejoiced, but even they admitted the truth. He had lived and died as a man of destiny. His brilliance, his cruelty, his ambition had burned so brightly that even in defeat, he was remembered. In Italy, whispers of the Borgias faded into legend. Lucrezia, far away in Ferrara, would live on as a duchess of grace and power. Alexander's name became synonymous with corruption, and Cesare, the inspiration for Machiavelli's prince, remained a symbol of ruthless ambition. A man who might have united Italy had fate given him time. The Borgia dream was gone, but their story was never forgotten, because power, once tasted, leave behind a shadow that history can never erase. The bull had fallen. Cesare Borgia's broken body lay in the dirt of Iana, his enemies triumphant, his empire gone. With him died the last hope of a Borgia kingdom in Italy. Yet the story of the Borgias did not end with the sword. It endured in whispers and chronicles, in scandal and fear. Lucrezia Borgia, once reviled as the poisonous daughter of Rome, found a new life in Ferrara. There, as duchess, she shed the mask of corruption and emerged as a patroness of the arts, a refined and respected ruler. The poets praised her beauty, musicians celebrated her grace, and the court of Ferrara flourished under her presence. But behind the silks and songs, rumors never stopped. Had she truly been her father's pawn or her brother's accomplice in crime? The truth was buried with her, leaving only mystery. Rodrigo Borgia, Pope Alexander VI, whose ambition had carved kingdoms and bought cardinals, remained infamous in death. He was remembered not as a shepherd of souls, but as a prince of corruption, a pope who turned the Vatican into a theater of power and lust. To some, he was a devil in a papal crown. To others, a genius who understood the world as it truly was. And Cesare, the brightest flame of them all, lived on in memory greater than any victory could have given him. His conquests, his betrayals, his audacity, all became the stuff of legend. Machiavelli, who watched him rise and fall, immortalized him, the prince, as the model of ruthless leadership. Proof that greatness comes not from birth but from will. The Borgias were gone, but their name was never forgotten. To their enemies, it became a curse, a synonym for poison, corruption, and ambition without mercy. To historians, they became a mirror of their age, an Italy torn by greed, power, and betrayal. And to storytellers, they became eternal, a dynasty half demon, half divine, too powerful to live quietly, too flawed to survive. Even today, 5 centuries later, the name Borgia stirs the imagination. Were they monsters or visionaries? Sinners, or simply players in a world where power was the only truth? Perhaps the answer lies in what Cesare himself once said, "I am fortune's man." And when fortune turned, the Borgias fell, but their shadow remained, a shadow that still lingers in the halls of the Vatican, in the towers of Italy, and in the dark pages of history.